Title: The Devil's Waltz. Chapter 1. The Mysterious Musician. The city felt quieter that night, like the air itself had been drained of its life. Ethan, wrapped in the familiar embrace of his trench coat, walked alone down the damp alleyways, the puddles reflecting the sickly glow of flickering streetlights above. He had taken this route countless times before without incident, but tonight was different. There was something in the air, something unspoken, something waiting just behind the corner, as though the city itself were holding its breath. The rain had stopped, but the mist still clung to the pavement, making the ground slick and treacherous. Each footstep echoed in the silence, amplified by the emptiness of the streets. Ethan's mind wandered back to the events of the past week, the slow unraveling of his life, the untimely death of his sister, the inheritance of her old apartment, the strange inheritance letter she'd left behind. These things had been gnawing at him like hungry rats in his thoughts. He had been walking for what felt like hours, the weight of grief pressing down on his chest. Yet, in the midst of his sorrow, something unusual caught his ear. A soft, almost imperceptible sound. Something familiar, yet foreign. It was music, but not like any music he'd ever heard before. It wasn't the upbeat melody of a jazz bar or the familiar hum of a radio. It was something darker, something ancient, like the kind of song you might hear in a dream just before waking, when the edges of reality blur and become fluid. The sound seemed to come from further ahead, beyond the corner, deeper into the heart of the empty streets. It beckoned him. A shiver crept down his spine, but he couldn't bring himself to turn back. His feet moved on their own, drawn toward the melody like a moth to a flame. The violin strings pulled at him in waves, the haunting melody tugging at his soul. As he rounded the corner, he saw him, the figure. At first, it was barely a silhouette, just a vague shape framed by the glow of a street lamp. The figure stood still, one arm extended gracefully, the bow of a violin held delicately between pale fingers. The bow moved across the strings with a slow, deliberate motion, as though the man had all the time in the world. The music hung in the air like smoke, curling and twisting, thick with melancholy and foreboding. The man's face was hidden in shadow, his features obscured by the hood of a dark cloak that seemed to swallow the light. But Ethan could feel his eyes, could feel them searching through the fog of the night, locking onto him. There was something unsettling about the stillness of the man, the way he seemed to exist outside of time, the way his music reverberated in the very bones of the city. As Ethan stepped closer, the air grew colder, and the melody took on a new layer, a tremor of something darker, more ancient. It wasn't just a song anymore, it was a call, a summons. Ethan's feet moved without his consent, dragging him closer to the source of the music. He had to see this person, had to understand what was happening. And then the violinist stopped. The music stopped abruptly, as if cut off by an unseen hand, leaving only the faint echo of the last note hanging in the air. The street seemed unnaturally still, as though the world had paused just for him. The figure turned slowly, and Ethan's heart skipped a beat as the man's face came into view. He was impossibly pale, his skin translucent, as though the blood had long since drained from his veins. His eyes were dark, endless pits that seemed to pull at the edges of reality, making Ethan question if they were even human. A smile, too wide for any man, stretched across the musician's face, revealing teeth that were unnaturally sharp. "Do you hear it?" the man asked, his voice smooth and deep, like the roll of thunder in the distance. "Do you hear the music? It plays for you now." Ethan swallowed, his throat dry. He wanted to speak, to ask who this man was, what he was doing here, why he was playing that cursed melody. But the words caught in his throat, like a stone lodged deep inside. He felt something else then, a strange compulsion, like the music had already gotten into his bones, burrowing deep beneath his skin. The violinist took a step toward him, his movements fluid and unnerving, like a predator stalking its prey. "It has been so long since I've had a willing dancer," the man continued, his smile widening even further. "So long since someone has heard my song and come to dance." "Dance?" Ethan's voice trembled as he stepped backward, his chest tightening. "I don't—" The man's eyes flashed, and suddenly the air grew thick, as if the entire street had become heavy, oppressive. The ground beneath Ethan's feet seemed to shift, and for a brief moment, the city around him disappeared. The sound of the violin swelled, louder now, more insistent, as if the music were pulling at his very soul. "You have already danced," the man whispered, his voice coming from all directions. "We are all dancers in this waltz, Ethan. You're just too blind to see it." Ethan's knees buckled, and he stumbled, his body betraying him, pulling him closer to the figure. The violin song wrapped around him like a tightening noose. The man's face loomed closer, his eyes pulling Ethan deeper into their dark depths, making it impossible to think. "No!" Ethan gasped, shaking his head violently. "I don't want this, I don't—" But the violinist was already raising his bow again, and the music resumed. It was like a spell, hypnotic and impossible to resist. Each note seemed to reach deeper inside him, plucking at the darkest corners of his mind. "You will hear it," the man said, his smile wide and unsettling. "You will hear it until your very soul belongs to me." The final chord rang through the air, sharp and high-pitched, as though it were splitting the sky itself. And in that moment, Ethan knew. There was no escape. The waltz had already begun. Chapter 1. The Mysterious Musician continued. Ethan stumbled backward, his pulse hammering in his chest. His body refused to obey his frantic mind, as if the very air around him had turned to stone. He could hear the music, hear it like a creeping fog wrapping around him, pulling him into its thick tendrils. Every note echoed like a heartbeat, rhythmically pulsing through his skull. He clenched his fists, feeling the cold bite of the rain-soaked cobblestones beneath his shoes, and yet the chill was nothing compared to the icy grip that seemed to tighten around his chest. His breath quickened as he tried to move, to get away, but his feet remained rooted to the spot. The figure, that pale, monstrous figure, stood before him, a dark statue in the fog, the violin still dangling from his delicate skeletal fingers. His eyes were black as voids, yet they glittered with an intensity that made Ethan feel naked, exposed in a way he couldn't describe. The violinist began to play again, his movements graceful, his fingers dancing across the strings. The sound was now different, more intense, more desperate. It was as if the music itself was alive, pulsing with energy, drawing on something beyond the physical world. Each note carried a weight, each string a command. The more Ethan tried to resist, the more the music seemed to wrap itself around him, binding him to the spot. "What do you want from me?" Ethan's voice was barely a whisper, shaking in the cold, wet air. The violinist's head tilted to one side, the smile on his lips stretching impossibly wide, too wide to be human. It was a smile that didn't belong in the world of the living. It was the kind of smile you would see in a nightmare, one that gnawed at your sanity, left you wondering if your mind was betraying you. "What do I want?" the violinist repeated, his voice soft yet sharp, like the edge of a blade. "I want nothing more than what has always been mine, Ethan." His fingers plucked a few dissonant notes, and they reverberated like distant thunder. "You will understand soon enough." Ethan's stomach churned. His pulse thundered in his ears, and his legs felt like they were made of lead. The music seeped into him, pulling his thoughts away from his surroundings. There was something about it, something in the air, that didn't make sense. He could feel his vision blur at the edges, as if reality itself was bending under the weight of the music. "Why are you doing this?" Ethan demanded again, his voice cracking under the strain. "What is this? What do you want with me?" The violinist's laugh was soft, like the rustling of dry leaves in the wind. It wasn't a sound meant to comfort, though. It was a sound that made Ethan's skin crawl, made his heart race in dread. "I do not want you, Ethan," the violinist whispered, his voice suddenly close, like a breath against his ear. "But you are already mine. You just haven't accepted it yet." Ethan's mind was spinning, caught between the reality of the man in front of him and the bizarre, intangible sensation that his body was being drawn into the music, into the very fabric of the air. He struggled to breathe, to move, but his limbs felt like they had turned to stone. The violinist raised his eyes, locking them with Ethan's. His pupils seemed to ripple, as if the darkness in his gaze was a living thing, crawling through Ethan's very soul. Ethan wanted to scream, but no sound emerged. His mouth was dry, his thoughts tangled, lost in the hypnotic pull of the music. It wasn't just sound anymore. It was power. It was force. The strings of the violin wove through his thoughts like invisible threads, tugging him closer to something he didn't understand. "You are already here, Ethan," the violinist repeated, his voice a low croon. "You're in the dance now, and there is no leaving." Suddenly, the music shifted again. The sound was so sudden, so sharp, that it pierced through the fog and into the very depths of his mind. Ethan gasped, feeling a violent shudder run through his body. The music wasn't just around him anymore. It was inside him, clawing through his ribs, pulling his heart toward the rhythm. His chest felt tight, as if the very air around him had become thick and suffocating. It was no longer just an eerie song. It was a command, a compulsion. He wanted to run. He needed to escape. But as the violinist's melody flowed and swirled in the air, Ethan's legs moved without his will, slowly, as if they were being controlled by something far older, far darker than anything he had ever known. "Stop!" Ethan gasped, panic rising in his throat. "Please!" The violinist's smile didn't falter. If anything, it grew, like a predator savoring the fear of its prey. "Why fight it?" he asked, his voice smooth and dark. "You know what you are, what you've always been, a dancer like the rest of us. And once the music calls you, there's no turning back. All you have to do is listen." Ethan's eyes widened. A dancer? He could barely think. The music was suffocating him, pressing down on his lungs, filling his mind. He could feel his body moving to the rhythm of the violin, as though it were no longer his own. Each step he took brought him closer to the musician, and with each step, the darkness around him seemed to close in tighter. Suddenly, the world around him began to distort. The buildings that lined the street blurred and melted away like shadows in the fog. The streetlights flickered, casting eerie, ghostly shapes on the pavement. And through the fog, he could hear it. The faint whispers of voices, chanting, urging him to join the dance. Ethan's breath came faster, his heart pounding in his chest. He had to fight this. He had to break free. "Stop it!" he shouted, his voice raw, desperate. But the violinist didn't stop. His hands moved over the strings with a slow, deliberate pace, as though he were drawing out the very last ounce of Ethan's resistance. For a moment, time seemed to stretch, the air thick with anticipation. Ethan could feel the very ground beneath his feet begin to shift, the reality of the street slipping away. His mind was slipping with it, his thoughts fading into the music, his body swaying involuntarily to its rhythm. "Come now, Ethan," the violinist purred. "It's time. Time to dance." Chapter 2. The Dance of Shadows. Ethan's limbs jerked, as if strings were attached to his joints and his body was nothing but a marionette. His mind screamed for him to stop, to run, to fight against the force pulling him toward the violinist. But the music, that infernal music, drowned his thoughts. Every note wrapped around his consciousness like a chain, locking him in place, binding him to the rhythm. His feet moved against his will, gliding over the wet pavement, as though he were walking on air. He looked at his own hands, trembling, yet they danced with the precision of someone who had practiced for years. His legs shifted, his arms swayed, and his body seemed to fall into step with the unknown force guiding him. The movements were not his own. They were alien, foreign, as though they belonged to someone else, someone long dead. He tried to scream, tried to break free, but his voice was swallowed by the music. It seeped into him like a poison, filling his ears, his lungs, his very soul. There was nothing but the violinist's haunting melody, filling the air with a cold, unyielding pressure. "Let it happen," the violinist's voice purred from the shadows, smooth and coaxing. "You can't fight what is already inside you." Ethan's head jerked toward the sound, but the violinist was no longer where he had been standing. The fog had thickened, swallowing the street in an oppressive silence. The violin's melody now seemed to come from everywhere, above, below, and behind him. It was no longer tied to a singular point. The song was everywhere. It surrounded him. It consumed him. With every turn of his body, he felt the weight of something ancient pressing down on him. It was like the ground beneath his feet wasn't solid. It was as though he were walking on shifting sand, sinking into something deep and unknowable. The fog was thick now, and he could no longer see his hands clearly in front of him. Yet, somehow, he still danced. His body moved with the music, the steps growing faster, more frantic, as if it were some kind of ritual he had no say in. He stumbled. His foot caught on something unseen, and for a moment he thought he would fall. But his body instinctively twisted and spun, gliding, never once touching the ground. He was floating, spinning in mid-air, propelled by nothing but the music. The world around him twisted, as though reality itself were bending to the rhythm of the violin. The whispers returned. Low, guttural voices echoed from the fog, their words unintelligible, but their intent clear. They urged him on, spurring him to dance faster, harder. His heart pounded in his chest, the rhythm matching the frantic pace of his movements. Then, a sharp sound, like a crack of thunder, cut through the air, snapping Ethan from his trance for a brief moment. He gasped, his breath ragged. The music faltered, just for an instant, and in that silence, his mind cleared. He could think, he could reason. This wasn't real, it couldn't be. But then the violin played again. The sound was sharp, cold, and insistent, wrapping itself around him like a vice. He tried to stop moving, but his legs refused to obey. His body twisted against his will, as though the music had taken root inside him. He was part of it now. He could feel something inside him. The dance wasn't just a dance. It was a summoning, a ritual. His vision blurred again. The world around him darkened, and he began to lose his sense of self. He could feel his identity slipping away with each movement. He wasn't Ethan anymore. He was something else, something ancient, something forgotten. Suddenly, the music stopped. Ethan froze. His breath hitched in his throat, but the world around him didn't stop spinning. He was still moving, still floating, his body caught in a perpetual motion, even though the violin had gone silent. "What's happening?" he gasped, his voice barely audible. "You've been chosen," a voice whispered, not from the violinist, but from somewhere else, somewhere far, far deeper. The voice was soft, but it resonated in his bones, vibrating through him. "You will dance forever. It's what we do. It's what we always do." The words made his blood run cold. He tried to fight back, tried to scream again, but his mouth didn't move. His throat was tight, constricted, as though his very voice had been stolen from him. In the distance, he saw a figure emerging from the fog. The violinist. His pale face was now illuminated by the faint glow of the streetlights, his features sharp and angular, like something not quite human. The shadows clung to him like a cloak, making him appear even more monstrous. "Do you feel it?" the violinist asked softly, his voice like a breeze brushing across Ethan's skin. "The weight of it. The dance that never ends?" Ethan tried to speak, to beg for mercy, but the words wouldn't come. The music swelled again, as if it were laughing at his feeble attempts to resist. The violinist's eyes locked onto his, and for a moment, Ethan saw something beyond the man, something ancient, something alive in those dark, fathomless depths. The figure's smile widened, stretching unnaturally, as if his face were being pulled by invisible strings. It was a grotesque mockery of a human smile, and it chilled Ethan to the core. "You are mine now," the violinist whispered, as though reading Ethan's mind. "You belong to the music. You belong to the dance." And then, as if on cue, the world around Ethan shattered. The ground beneath him split open, and the fog swirled around him in a storm of shadows. He felt himself being pulled downward, sucked into a black void that stretched endlessly below. His body was still moving, still trapped in the rhythm of the dance. The music, the dance grew louder, its intensity surging like a tidal wave crashing over him. He couldn't hear anything but the song, couldn't see anything but the endless spiral of the dance. He was drowning in it. The voice, the others, began to speak again, their words blending together in a chorus of whispers. He couldn't understand them, but he didn't need to. He could feel them. Feel their hunger, their desire to consume him, to take him into the endless, unbroken dance. The last thing he saw before the darkness swallowed him whole was the violinist, his eyes gleaming with a cold, knowing light, his smile never fading. Chapter 2. The Dance of Shadows, extended. Ethan's body jerked against his will, every movement a betrayal of his very soul. His feet shuffled, then glided over the slick, wet pavement as if they were connected to invisible strings. His mind screamed in protest, a chorus of frantic, desperate thoughts, pleading with him to stop, to run, to wake up. But the music, the infernal, hypnotic melody of the violin, drowned out everything else. It wrapped itself around his consciousness like a chain, locking him in place, rendering him incapable of defiance. The world around him shifted. The fog thickened, swallowing everything but the glowing streetlights, which flickered in time with the pulse of the music. Ethan tried to focus, tried to anchor himself to something solid in the chaos of his racing thoughts. But it was impossible. His body moved without command, twisting and turning, his limbs pulling him in directions that felt both alien and unnatural. He could no longer control his own movements. He was no longer the master of his body. He glanced down at his feet, his shoes skimming the wet surface of the road, the soles barely touching the ground. It was as if he were gliding over the pavement, weightless, as though gravity itself had abandoned him. His arms, too, moved of their own accord, swaying, arching, bending, each gesture more fluid than the last, like a marionette caught in an eternal twisted ballet. "No!" Ethan wanted to shout, but his voice betrayed him. His mouth moved, but no words came out, only a strangled gasp. The air around him felt thick, saturated with the strange, otherworldly pressure of the music that pressed down on him from all sides. His heart raced in his chest, but the beat no longer matched the rhythm of his own body. It was too slow, too erratic. The music pushed him faster, compelling him to move in sync with its endless pulsing cadence. It wasn't just music. It was alive. It breathed. It reached into him and took root inside, spreading like fire through his veins. His breath came faster, heavier, but still the music surged, pushing him onward. In his peripheral vision, the fog began to take on an unnatural shape. Shadows twisted, elongated, their forms shifting in time with the melody. The streetlights flickered once more, casting fleeting, distorted shapes on the wet pavement. Everything around him seemed warped, as though reality itself was bending to the will of the violin's song. Then, as he spun in a sudden, uncontrollable pirouette, he saw it. The figure, at first just a silhouette, stood at the far end of the street, the edge of its body hidden by the thick fog. A man. Tall, pale. His form was hauntingly slender, almost skeletal. He stood still, his back straight, his hands raised as though conducting the very air around him. The violinist. Ethan's chest tightened. A strange, paralyzing terror filled him, even as his body continued to sway to dance. There was something unnatural about the man, something grotesque, something wrong. His face was hidden in shadow, but the music, the song that emanated from his bow, seemed to direct itself toward Ethan, as if calling him, beckoning him to come closer. "Come closer," the voice came again, but this time it was not just a whisper. It was deeper, richer, almost melodic in itself. The voice seeped into Ethan's thoughts, bypassing his consciousness and sinking straight into his soul. It promised something, but the promise was veiled in shadows. Ethan tried to fight it. He could feel his muscles burning, could feel the tension in his joints. But no matter how hard he willed himself to stop, his feet kept moving. His arms kept raising, spinning him into a dance he didn't understand. He felt the world spinning around him, faster and faster, as if the ground beneath him were dissolving, and the air itself were taking on a life of its own, twisting and pulling him deeper into the fog. "You cannot escape," the voice murmured, this time with a cold certainty that chilled Ethan to his core. "You've already taken the first step. You've already danced, and now you belong to it. You belong to us." Ethan's chest heaved with each ragged breath. His feet dragged across the road, his body twisted against the music's command. But still he danced. Why? Why was this happening? What had he done to deserve this? And why couldn't he stop? The figure at the end of the street began to move toward him. Slow at first, like a predator stalking its prey, but then faster, much faster, his movements flowing with the music as if he were part of it. The violinist's form blurred in the mist, his body almost a shadow, and the closer he came, the more Ethan could feel the pull, the inexorable draw of the music. It was as if his very existence had become tied to this man and his haunting song. "You will dance," the violinist said, his voice a soft command, but one laced with a sinister promise. "And you will dance forever. There is no end, only the rhythm, only the song. You will be part of it, and it will be part of you." Ethan's limbs trembled, but he was powerless to stop. His body was no longer his own. It was the dance, the music, and the violinist that held him. The figure was almost upon him now, and Ethan could feel a coldness radiating from him, as though the very essence of death hung about him like a shroud. His skin crawled. The closer the violinist came, the more Ethan could feel the oppressive weight of the song, the more his mind began to unravel. And then, the violinist's face came into view. At first, Ethan thought it was just a trick of the shadows, a distortion in the fog. But no, the figure's face was pale, almost too pale, and gaunt, like something that had been long dead. His eyes, if they could be called eyes, were dark voids, empty and hollow, without a trace of human warmth. His lips were twisted into a grotesque smile, too wide, stretching unnaturally across his face. The violinist raised his bow again, and for a fleeting moment, the air around them fell silent, as though the world itself was holding its breath. Then, with one sharp, swift motion, he struck the strings of the violin once more. The sound was unbearable. It was a scream, a high-pitched wail that tore through Ethan's very being. It shattered his thoughts, his consciousness, his soul. The music burrowed into him, filling every crevice, every corner of his mind, until there was nothing left of him but the dance. His body twisted in the air, lifted by an unseen force, as if the strings of fate themselves were being pulled. "No!" he screamed internally, but no sound came. "You belong to us now!" The violinist's voice echoed in his mind, low and mocking, as if Ethan had become nothing more than an instrument, a puppet for the music to command. "You are mine, and I will never let you go." And in that moment, Ethan understood. He was lost. The music would never stop. The dance would never end. He would never be free. Chapter 3. The Dance of the Damned. The fog thickened, curling like restless tendrils, swallowing the street into a disorienting haze. Ethan's breath came in ragged gasps, and every exhale vanished into the mists, lost to the night. The pull of the music, the hypnotic rhythm of the violin was suffocating, relentless. It had taken root in him. His movements were no longer his own. He wasn't even sure if he was truly here anymore, or if this was all just a nightmare, a twisted dream from which he could never wake. He had tried to scream. He had tried to break free. His voice, once strong and defiant, now came out as a strangled whimper, a sound barely audible against the deafening pulse of the violin. But the more he struggled, the more it seemed to intensify. The melody twisted around him, wrapping its invisible fingers around his throat, squeezing tighter with every passing second. "You will dance, Ethan. You have no choice." The voice came from the violinist, the man who stood at the far end of the street, a dark silhouette against the hazy backdrop. His pale face was now visible, his eyes like black voids, empty and cold. A smile spread across his features, one that was not meant for joy but for something far more sinister. His presence was like a shadow, creeping and all-encompassing, his every movement matching the erratic pulse of the music. Ethan's legs moved in time with the haunting melody, his feet dragging him forward as though bound by invisible chains. His heart pounded in his chest, but the beat was out of sync with the music. It was an echo of his own fear, a drumbeat of panic that couldn't match the rhythm he was being forced to follow. His arms lifted of their own accord, swaying like branches caught in a windless storm. His body spun in an impossible fluid motion, the muscles in his legs screaming with protest. But he couldn't stop. Every movement was precision, every turn calculated by something outside of him, something dark and powerful that had taken control. A pulse of light flickered above him, a distant streetlight that seemed to hum in time with the music, its illumination cutting through the fog in jagged beams. It cast fleeting shadows on the pavement, and in those brief moments, he saw it. Figures, watching him from the corners of his vision. They were not human, not fully. The figures had no faces, only hollow eyes and twisted ethereal shapes, like ghosts or spirits trapped in the fog. They glided alongside him, their presence suffocating, their hollow gazes fixed on him. Are they real? Ethan wondered. His mind was beginning to fracture, the line between reality and nightmare blurring. He could hear their whispers now, a chorus of soft voices that joined with the haunting melody of the violin. Dance, Ethan. Dance forever, the voices murmured, drifting like smoke around him. The words repeated, slow and deliberate, like a chant, an incantation. He felt the cold weight of despair settle in his chest as he realized that the dance, the music, it was never going to end. His body was no longer his own, but a vessel for the song, for the rhythm, for the madness that came with it. He was a puppet, dangling on strings that only the violinist controlled. Every fiber of his being screamed for freedom, but there was none. The fog began to thicken, its tendrils curling higher, wrapping themselves around the streetlights, like ropes binding him further into this nightmare. With every step, every movement, the fog seemed to pulse, reacting to the music, to the dance. The street, once familiar, had become a darkened labyrinth, its edges lost in the mist, and each streetlight now seemed like a beacon to guide him deeper into the unknown. Where are you taking me? He thought, the words trapped in his mind, a question he could not speak aloud. His lips moved, but no sound escaped. He was here, trapped within this endless cycle of dancing and music, bound to the violin's command. The figure of the violinist seemed to grow taller with every passing moment, as though the shadows themselves were feeding off the song. He moved with a fluid grace that was almost otherworldly, each motion perfectly synchronized with the music, like a being of pure rhythm. His bow glided across the strings of the violin, the sound never ceasing, never waning. It echoed through the fog, reverberating in Ethan's mind, burrowing deeper and deeper into his thoughts. You belong to me now, the voice came again, this time with an unmistakable weight, an authority that crushed whatever resistance remained in Ethan's spirit. It was a promise. It was a curse. His vision blurred, the shadows around him growing deeper, more sinister. The whispers grew louder, almost deafening now. They were no longer just voices in his mind. They were all around him, circling like vultures, their words incomprehensible, but full of malice. Dance! Ethan's body lurched again, spinning in an impossible arc. He was no longer just walking, no longer merely dancing, he was flying. The sensation of weightlessness overwhelmed him, his feet barely touching the ground as he spun faster and faster, the world around him nothing but a blur of light and darkness. The music, the violin, the figure of the man, it all blended together in an unholy harmony, an ever-growing crescendo that threatened to shatter the very fabric of his being. Suddenly, the ground beneath him gave way. He felt the sharpness of the cold concrete below, a harsh reminder that he was still tethered to the world of the living. The fall should have felt real, should have broken him. But as his body hit the pavement, there was no pain, only the unrelenting pull of the music, the tug of the violin's song. He lay there, motionless for a moment, gasping for air, his lungs burning. And then, as though drawn by an invisible force, he slowly began to rise again. His legs buckled, but he was on his feet once more, moving of their own accord. The shadows crept closer, wrapping around his ankles like tendrils, pulling him further into the fog. Through the swirling mist, he saw the violinist once more, but this time, something had changed. The figure no longer appeared as human. The violinist had become something else, something monstrous. His pale, emaciated form was elongated, his arms reaching out like claws. His face, once smooth and serene, was now grotesque. His features twisted and distorted, his eyes empty voids, staring through Ethan as though he were nothing more than a vessel, a means to an end. "You are mine," the violinist whispered, the words curling around Ethan's mind like a lover's caress. His voice was no longer the soft, melodic command it had been before. Now it was a growl, a deep, guttural sound that seemed to come from the very depths of hell itself. "Dance for me, Ethan. Dance until your soul is gone. Dance until you are nothing but dust and bones." The finality of the words hit Ethan like a blow. He was already gone. He could feel it in his bones. This was it. There would be no rescue. There would be no escape. The violinist's bow raised once again, and Ethan, despite his terror, was compelled to follow the music. His body, his soul, everything belonged to it now. The fog swallowed him whole, and the music enveloped him, pulling him deeper into the dark heart of the night, where nothing would ever again be the same. Chapter 3. The Dance of the Damned, continued. The street stretched before Ethan like a twisted, never-ending path, a nightmare that curled in upon itself, the fog weaving around the lampposts and dissolving into the shadows. The echo of the violin played on, a distorted symphony that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It gnawed at the edges of his sanity, slowly eroding his sense of time, place, and self. It's a trick. It has to be. I can wake up. I can end this. Ethan's mind screamed for reason, but his body, his cursed, unwilling body, refused to comply. With every step, every movement, the coldness grew. The fog thickened until it became a choking haze, making the air dense and suffocating, as though it were trying to consume him whole. His hands trembled, but it wasn't from the cold. It was from something far darker. The fog, like the music, had become a living thing, pulling him deeper into the madness. His feet moved of their own accord, each step taking him further down the same twisted street, the same eerie path that looped and spiraled in endless circles. He tried to stop, tried to turn back, but it was like trying to break free from an invisible web. His body moved against his will, obeying an unseen force, the pulse of the violin growing louder, more insistent, the sound invading his thoughts, his consciousness. It was as if the violinist's music was no longer just sound. It was something tangible, something that wrapped around him like chains, pulling him forward into the very heart of the night. Is this what it means to be trapped? The question echoed in his mind as his legs carried him further along the mist-filled street, a path that seemed to lead nowhere and everywhere at once. Each step seemed to bring him closer to something. But what? The violin played with a madness, a wildness now, and the darkness felt thick, heavy with an ominous presence. Ethan's thoughts grew more fragmented with each passing second, like pieces of a puzzle that didn't fit together. He could feel his grip on reality slipping away, the line between waking and dreaming dissolving into something far worse. He wasn't sure if his feet were even touching the ground anymore. He moved, but he couldn't feel the earth beneath him, only the weight of the fog, the oppressive feeling of being watched, stalked by something ancient and cruel. "Ethan!" The voice came again. It was quiet, almost a whisper, but it was everywhere. It slipped into his mind, wrapping around him like a vice. The violin's song wove through it, and he could hear it, the low growl of the violinist's voice, the malice lacing every syllable. "You are mine. There is no escape. Dance for me, Ethan. Dance forever." It wasn't a question. It wasn't even a command. It was a statement of undeniable fact, a truth so absolute it reverberated through his very soul. He was lost. He had been lost the moment the violin's bow had first scraped across the strings. The street seemed to twist again. Or was it his mind? He couldn't tell anymore. There were no clear lines between reality and the nightmare, only the fog, only the violinist, and the slow rhythmic pull of the dance. His feet continued to move, even though he begged them to stop, even though every part of his body screamed for release. He felt a sudden presence behind him. A shadow, tall and imposing, reached out with fingers that brushed the back of his neck, sending a shiver down his spine. The coldness that accompanied it was unnatural, impossibly cold, like the touch of death itself. "Do you hear it, Ethan?" The voice whispered again, sharp and cold as ice. The fog parted briefly, just enough for him to see the figure of the violinist in the distance. He was standing still, as if waiting for Ethan to catch up, but the violin was still playing, its song never ceasing. "Come to me," the violinist called out. The words were soft, seductive, but there was a deep, terrifying finality to them. "You cannot resist." Ethan tried to move away, but his legs felt like stone. He was rooted in place, the weight of the fog and the sound of the violin pulling him toward that figure, that thing. Suddenly, the street seemed to warp. The world itself bent in on itself, twisting like a reflection in a broken mirror. The ground beneath his feet began to shift, as though the earth was no longer solid but a living thing, pulsing with a dark energy. The lights above him flickered, their glow fading in and out, casting long, contorted shadows that seemed to reach toward him like grasping hands. His heart thundered in his chest. The streetlights, once comforting, now felt like cold, indifferent eyes watching him. The figures in the shadows, those pale, faceless shapes, watched too. They were closer now, closer than before. They were not human. Not really. He could feel it deep within his bones. Their presence was suffocating, like the last breath of a dying animal. The violinist's laugh cut through the fog. It wasn't a laugh of amusement. It wasn't warm or comforting. It was a sound of pure malice, the kind of laugh that sent chills down your spine and made your skin crawl. "You cannot run, Ethan. You cannot escape the dance. It's already begun." The words sliced through the air, cold as steel. The fog swirled around him, tightening its grip. He felt the coldness seep into his bones, his muscles locking up, forcing him to move, to obey. The street around him seemed to stretch further and further. He couldn't see an end. There was no end. The darkness was swallowing him whole, and the music, the violin, it was becoming his world. His thoughts were slipping, fading into the fog, replaced by the rhythm of the dance. It was impossible to think, impossible to fight. All he could do was follow the music. Suddenly he felt it, a pull, strong and fierce, as if something was yanking at the very core of his being. It wasn't just the music anymore. It was the violinist's presence, his essence, sinking deep into Ethan's soul. The pull was overwhelming, like being dragged through a vortex, a hole in space and time. It was as though the violinist was trying to possess him, take over every part of him, until there was nothing left. The figures in the shadows began to move toward him, their hollow eyes staring, unblinking. The whispers grew louder, their voices no longer soft and distant, but harsh, filled with venom and hatred. The fog became suffocating, thickening like smoke, making it difficult to breathe. He could barely see now, only the faint silhouette of the violinist, his face twisted in an expression of cruel satisfaction. "Dance, Ethan," the violinist said, his voice deep and mocking. The coldness in the air intensified, and with it came a sense of finality, a crushing weight that told him, deep in his gut, that this was it. There would be no more resistance. The dance had begun, and it would never end. Ethan's feet moved of their own accord, each step heavy and slow, as if he were being pulled by an invisible force. His body, his soul, everything was giving in. He felt his will shatter, piece by piece, as the violin's song surged through him, filling every corner of his mind. He was no longer Ethan. He was a puppet, a dancer in the hands of something far more ancient, far more terrifying than he could ever imagine. And the dance would never end. Chapter 4. The dance of the forgotten Ethan's world had ceased to exist as it once did. The familiar sounds of the world outside, the hum of cars, the rustle of leaves, the everyday noise of life, had long since faded into an empty silence, replaced by the relentless strain of the violin. It was an agonizing, unyielding sound that stretched time into a distorted loop, a sound that made his blood run cold and his skin crawl. The world around him no longer made sense. Time, too, was warped, suspended in an eternal twilight where shadows stretched and shrank, like puppets in the hands of a cruel master. The street beneath his feet had become an endless stretch of grey. The pavement no longer reflected the dim light of the lamps above, but seemed to absorb it instead. The light itself was weaker now, flickering in and out of existence, leaving only pools of darkness in its wake. The fog had grown thick again, choking the air, heavy with something dark and old, ancient, like the presence of death itself. The figures in the distance, shadowy, faceless, had multiplied, though they never approached him. They only watched, silent, waiting. Each time Ethan tried to move away, to find a way out, his body betrayed him, as if tethered to the very rhythm of the violin's song. Every part of him, his arms, his legs, even his mind was bound to the dance. He couldn't stop. The music played inside his head, louder and louder, until it became a maddening roar. His pulse matched the tempo, his breath shallow, as if he were running a race he could never finish. His heart ached with each step, but still, he danced. At first, he had hoped that the figure of the violinist, that shadow in the distance, would disappear, but it never did. No matter how far he walked, no matter how fast he tried to flee, the violinist remained in sight, always ahead, always waiting, his silhouette standing still in the fog, a beacon of inevitability. The eyes of the shadowy figures in the distance followed his every movement, and when he glanced toward them, they would melt back into the darkness, leaving nothing but a sense of eyes still on him. But the eyes, their eyes, were always there, and they were not human. The distant violinist's presence seemed to grow stronger, more oppressive with each passing moment. His silent gaze pierced through the fog, never shifting, never leaving. Ethan's every thought seemed to be consumed by him, by the dark energy that surrounded him. And that music, the violin's song that never stopped. It was no longer a melody. It had become a presence, a living thing that twisted and writhed around his mind, suffocating him, drowning him in despair. The haunting, discordant strains seemed to promise only one thing: there would be no escape. "Dance, Ethan!" The voice, a whisper, came again. But this time it was not coming from the violinist. It was coming from everywhere, from the shadows, from the mist, from his own head. The voice swirled around him like a tangible entity, wrapping around his mind, clawing at the edges of his thoughts. His pulse quickened, and his breath grew shallow as he felt the invisible grip on his soul tighten. He wanted to scream, but the scream died in his throat, suffocated by the very air he breathed. It was as if the fog itself was pressing in on him, not allowing a single breath of freedom. He could feel his legs moving again, slow, deliberate steps that matched the rhythm of the music. It was as if his body no longer belonged to him. The voices of the shadowy figures became clearer, rising above the fog like whispers caught on the wind. Their words, no longer soft murmurs but rasping, terrible sounds, seemed to call to him, beckoning him closer. But he was afraid. He was terrified of what might happen if he stepped too close. And then, as if in response to his fear, the violin's tempo quickened, the music rising in volume and intensity until it drowned out everything. It was a chaotic surge, as if the violin was playing faster than the world could follow. The darkness around him pulsed in time with the music, and the ground beneath his feet began to tremble. Ethan stumbled, his body shaking uncontrollably. He could feel the pull, the insidious force that had taken hold of him. He could no longer fight it. It was as though someone, was dragging him forward, toward the figure that stood like a king in the center of this desolate world. A shadow that promised oblivion. "Join the dance," came the whisper again, this time thick with malice. The voice wrapped itself around him like a noose. His feet moved on their own, reluctant but compelled. The shadows swelled in response, closing in, taking shape. For a moment, Ethan caught sight of something in the mist, a glimpse of a face that was not human. It was distorted, twisted, with hollow, empty eyes that seemed to stare into his very soul. And in that brief, fleeting moment, the mist parted enough to show him something that nearly broke him. The fog cleared just enough for him to see the faces of others. People, figures caught in the same eternal dance, their limbs locked in unnatural, broken positions. Their faces were twisted in agony, mouths frozen in silent screams. Their eyes, hollow and empty, reflected the same fear that gripped him. They were trapped just as he was, caught in the dance. Forever. God, no. Ethan wanted to scream, to run, but he couldn't. His feet, his body, they were no longer his own. His legs moved in jerky, unnatural motions, as if he too had become just another puppet in the violinist's twisted performance. The figure of the violinist stood ahead, his face hidden beneath the hood of a cloak that shimmered like shadows themselves. His hands held the violin, his long fingers moving expertly, caressing the strings as though the instrument were an extension of his very being. Ethan couldn't see his face, but he could feel his eyes on him, burning through the fog, digging into his soul. "You've come far, Ethan," the violinist said, his voice thick and dark. "But now the real dance begins." Ethan's breath caught in his throat. The music rose to an unbearable pitch, a dissonance so violent it made his insides twist. And then, without warning, he was moving faster. His body jerked and spun, as though he had lost all control. His arms flailed, his feet scrambled to find footing. He was not walking anymore. He was dancing. The figures around him, those wretched, twisted souls, began to move as well. Slowly at first, but as the tempo of the violin increased, they all began to move in time with the song. Each movement was jerky, unnatural, a horrific imitation of life. They danced in circles, their faces locked in expressions of horror, their bodies locked in grotesque, broken motions. And then, as the music soared higher, the mist thickened once more. The figures in the distance, the watchers, the faceless ones, came closer. Their eyes gleamed with hunger, their faces warped with malice. They had come to join the dance. The violinist's music filled the air, drowning out Ethan's thoughts, drowning out the last whispers of his own humanity. The dance was no longer something that could be stopped. There was no freedom, no escape. It was eternal. It was a curse. "We will dance forever, Ethan. There is no end to this waltz." The violinist's voice was a low rumble, a promise of eternity. And with that, the shadows closed in, the figures gathered, and Ethan, his mind shattered, his will broken, danced. Chapter 4. The Dance of the Forgotten continued. Ethan's body moved as if pulled by invisible strings, each step more violent, more forceful than the last. He tried to scream again, to shout, to fight against the overwhelming rhythm that consumed him, but his voice was smothered, buried beneath the crushing weight of the music. The violin's strings shrieked in his ears, and his heart followed the beat, an unwilling metronome for the infernal waltz. The fog thickened further, coiling around his limbs like chains, restricting his every movement. The world itself seemed to become liquid, swirling in a haze of grey and black. The figures in the distance began to draw nearer, their faces now twisted and contorted with pain. Their eyes, those hollow, unblinking eyes, followed Ethan's every move, and with each glance, their expressions grew darker, more twisted, as though they were feeding off his terror, drawing strength from his weakness. But Ethan couldn't stop. His limbs jerked, moving against his will, his body swaying with the tempo, like a puppet on a string. The violinist's presence was undeniable. It was as if he were the center of all this madness, his very being suffusing the air around Ethan, permeating his thoughts, drowning his mind. The bow slid expertly across the strings, pulling Ethan deeper into the dark abyss of the dance. His legs were no longer his own. They were instruments of the violin's cruel song, moving faster and faster until his breath came in ragged gasps, his chest aching with the effort to keep up. But no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't escape. There was no escape. "You cannot run, Ethan." The violinist's voice came again, dark and commanding, as if spoken directly into his soul. "You are already here, already part of the dance. There is no leaving once you've joined." The fog thickened until it became a wall, blotting out everything but the oppressive sound of the violin and the swaying bodies of the others. Those twisted figures whose eyes glowed with an otherworldly hunger. They moved as one, a mass of broken souls lost in an endless cycle of torment, forever spinning in place, their dance a twisted parody of life, Some of them were familiar. Faces Ethan thought he recognized. People from his past, from his life before this nightmare. But their faces were grotesque, unrecognizable, consumed by an emptiness that mirrored the void growing in Ethan's chest. "Join us, Ethan," a voice whispered from one of the figures. Ethan's heart lurched, and he forced himself to look away. He didn't want to see their faces anymore, didn't want to hear their voices, but the music drowned out all other thoughts, and his body obeyed. He stumbled forward, his feet sliding on the damp, slick pavement beneath him. He was no longer sure where the world ended and his mind began. His vision was a blur of movement, of bodies swirling in an endless, sickening dance. The violin played on, the music building in a crescendo of madness. Ethan could feel his sanity fraying at the edges, the threads of his being unraveling, one note at a time. The figures around him seemed to multiply, stretching out in all directions. Their eyes, cold, unfeeling, watched him as he danced. He could feel them inside his head now, their thoughts interwoven with his own, their voices filling the empty spaces in his mind. They whispered to him, telling him things he didn't want to hear. "You will never leave. You belong to the music now. Forever and ever. You will dance until your soul is torn apart." Each whisper twisted the knife deeper into his psyche, gnawing away at what little of himself he had left. His limbs were aching, his muscles burning with the effort of keeping up. But no matter how much it hurt, no matter how much he wanted to stop, his body refused to obey. It was as if the dance had become part of him, merging with his very soul, until there was nothing left but the violin's song and the endless, mindless movement. Suddenly, the violin's sound grew sharper, more piercing. The tempo quickened again, the notes crashing together in a discordant frenzy. Ethan's heart skipped a beat as his body jerked violently, his legs moving faster than ever before. The pain in his chest intensified, and he felt as if his heart might burst from his chest, but still he couldn't stop. The music, his torment, grew louder, louder, and louder, drowning everything else. It was suffocating. It was all-consuming. And then, just as he thought he might collapse, a figure stepped out of the shadows, its form emerging from the mist like a wraith. The air grew colder, and Ethan could feel the presence of this new figure wrapping around him like a shroud. It was tall, taller than any human, and its features were indistinct, cloaked in darkness. But as it moved, the shadows seemed to part, revealing a face, a grotesque, twisted face with hollow eyes and a twisted smile that stretched impossibly wide across its face. Ethan froze. The figure's eyes locked onto his, and for a moment, everything else ceased to exist. Time stood still. The music faltered for a fraction of a second, and then, as if summoned by the figure's gaze, the dance resumed. The figures around him picked up their pace, their movements jerky and unnatural, their limbs contorting in grotesque ways. Ethan felt a cold chill in his bones as he realized that the figure had not come to rescue him. It had come to claim him. The figure reached out, a long, bony hand stretching toward Ethan. It seemed to glide through the fog, its fingers long and skeletal, its touch cold and unnatural. The air around Ethan grew thick with an oppressive weight, as though the very space itself was closing in on him. "You've come far," the figure whispered, its voice a hollow echo that seemed to reverberate in Ethan's skull. "But you cannot escape what you have become." Ethan tried to pull away, but his body betrayed him. He wanted to scream, to fight, to tear away from the figure's grasp, but his limbs refused to obey. He was locked in place, his heart racing, his breath coming in shallow gasps. The figure's smile widened, its eyes narrowing in a predatory gleam. Ethan could feel its cold fingers brushing against his skin, sending a jolt of fear through his body. He wanted to scream, but the words caught in his throat. His breath was stolen by the grip of the shadows that surrounded him, tightening around his chest, around his soul. And then the music swelled again, louder, faster, as if the violin itself was feeding off his terror. The figure leaned in close, its breath cold against Ethan's ear. "Dance, Ethan." The voice was not a whisper anymore, but a command, a demand. "Dance until there is nothing left of you." The figures around him closed in, their grotesque forms moving in time with the ever-quickening rhythm of the violin. Ethan could feel himself being pulled in, drawn into the vortex of their dance, his body moving in perfect synchronization with the horrific waltz. The world had become nothing but shadows, mist, and the eternal sound of that cursed violin. Dance, Ethan. The last of his will, the last of his humanity, began to slip away as he was consumed by the rhythm of the forgotten dance, the dance of those who had been lost, just as he was now lost. Chapter 5. The Dance of the Damned. The air around Ethan was thick, oppressive, suffocating. Each breath felt like an intrusion, a futile attempt to force life into a body that was beginning to feel more like an empty vessel, trapped in a prison of its own making. He could feel the weight of the curse pressing down on him, heavier with each passing second, a constant pull in the pit of his stomach, as if the world around him was slowly being sucked into an endless abyss. The violin's music still played, a shrieking wail that twisted and turned in his mind like a snake burrowing into his brain, each note more discordant than the last. But it wasn't the music that made his heart race, nor was it the strange, ethereal figures that surrounded him in the fog. It was the undeniable feeling of inevitability, the sense that he had already lost. The strings had caught him, and now they pulled him in their wake, dragging him toward an unknown fate. Ethan's hands trembled as he clutched at his sides, trying to will himself to stop moving, to stop dancing, but his body refused to listen. It moved with the rhythm, slow at first, hesitant, but then faster, more violently, as though his limbs had taken on a life of their own. The ground beneath his feet seemed to pulse with each step, a rhythmic thudding that matched the pounding of his heart. His body was no longer his own. It was just another puppet, its strings tangled in the web of the cursed music. He stumbled, his feet slipping as he lost his balance. But the moment his body threatened to collapse, the rhythm pulled him back. The music did not allow for weakness, did not allow for rest. It was relentless, a binding force, stronger than any will of man. He tried to scream, tried to call out, but the sound was drowned by the cacophony, swallowed by the eerie melody that echoed through the fog. The world around him seemed to close in, and with each step, the figures around him grew clearer, closer. The fog shifted, and before him, a figure emerged from the mist. At first, Ethan could barely make out its shape, the pale silhouette twisted and contorted by the shadows. But as the figure came closer, he saw her face. Her hair, once a vibrant red, now hung in matted strands, clinging to her hollow cheeks. Her skin was sickly pale, stretched tight over the bones, as though life had long since abandoned her. Her eyes were wide and unblinking, two hollow orbs staring at him with an unearthly emptiness. She stepped forward, her footfall as silent as the fog around them. The sound of her movement was a faint rustling, like dry leaves brushing against one another in the wind. Yet despite the quietness of her presence, Ethan could feel her in the marrow of his bones, as though she were a part of the very darkness that surrounded them. "You can't escape," the woman whispered, her voice a thin, haunting wisp that sent chills down Ethan's spine. It was as if the words came not from her lips, but from the very air around him. The violin shrieked in the distance, and he could feel the trembling in his chest, as if the music itself was clawing at his soul, demanding his attention. He swallowed, trying to speak, but his throat was dry, his mouth a desert. His body still moved with the rhythm, his feet shuffling involuntarily, his arms jerking slightly with each beat. The woman's eyes bore into him. "You think you're the first to be chosen? To dance in this endless waltz?" She moved closer, so close that he could smell the rancid decay that clung to her clothes. Her breath, when it came, was icy cold against his face. "I was once like you, free, alive. But now I am nothing but the echo of a soul, trapped by the strings of the violin." Ethan's heart raced as his body twitched and jerked with the rhythm. No, this can't be happening." His voice came out in a hoarse whisper, almost swallowed by the constant screeching of the violin. His eyes burned with tears, but he blinked them away, desperate to retain some semblance of control. But the woman did not stop. She reached out, placing a cold hand on his chest. You will never stop dancing. Never again. Ethan recoiled, but the moment he did, his legs were already moving again, pulling him forward, deeper into the fog. The ground beneath him felt uneven, shifting with each step. His feet seemed to sink slightly, as if the earth itself was trying to pull him down, drag him under. The figures around him began to shift, their faces becoming clearer with each passing moment. They were all the same, all trapped in the same cursed waltz. They are all like me, the woman's voice echoed in his mind. All of us, trapped by the music, the song of the damned. Ethan's mind was racing, his thoughts a blur. There was no escape. The truth of it hit him like a physical blow. He had been chosen, not by chance, but by fate. The violin had claimed him. He was no different than the others who danced around him, their bodies moving with the same mindless rhythm, their faces twisted in agony, their eyes empty. A scream tore from his throat as he tried to resist once again, but it was no use. The dance had already begun. His body obeyed the rhythm. His feet moved, his hands swayed. He was nothing more than another puppet, another lost soul caught in the endless waltz. The woman beside him didn't speak anymore. She merely watched, her empty eyes following his every movement. She had become a part of this cursed dance, and she knew what it meant to be lost. Ethan could see it in her face, the hollow emptiness, the pain, the regret. She had once been alive, once been free, but now, like all the others, she was nothing more than a shadow, an echo of what had been. As he danced, his mind began to fragment, his sense of self slipping away with each passing moment. His memories, his name, his past, the world he had known, faded like distant stars, consumed by the fog, consumed by the music. All that was left was the rhythm, the pull, the inevitability. He was becoming like them, a hollow, soulless thing, lost to the dance. And as the fog deepened around him, he felt it, a coldness that cut through his very being. The music was changing, warping, becoming something darker, more twisted. Each note seemed to tear at his insides, pulling at the very fabric of his existence. He wanted to scream, but there was no sound. He wanted to run, but his legs would not obey. The woman's voice whispered in his ear once again, but this time it was not a whisper. It was a scream, a wailing cry that matched the screeching violin. There is no end. No end for us. The dance, the song, it never ends. And then, just as he thought he could stand it no longer, the world around him seemed to shift, the fog closing in tighter, pressing against him from all sides. The faces of the other dancers blurred, their features distorted and mangled by the music. And in the center of it all, the violin, the source of the curse, the source of his torment. It was waiting for him. Chapter 6. Whispers beneath the strings. The fog had thickened to an almost suffocating degree, curling around Ethan's feet like writhing serpents, dragging him deeper into the heart of this cursed realm. He could no longer remember how long he had been trapped in this nightmare, his thoughts tangled in a haze of disjointed images and fractured memories. The oppressive silence was only broken by the incessant screech of the violin's strings, slicing through the air like the cries of tortured souls. Each note sent a jolt through his body, pushing him, forcing him to keep moving, to keep dancing. He tried to resist, but it was no use. His body refused to obey him. His legs were nothing but puppets, strings pulled by an unseen force, his arms swaying with the rhythm of the music as though they were born to do nothing but dance. His feet burned, his muscles screamed, but still, he could not stop. The fog closed in tighter, and the world around him seemed to warp and stretch. The distant figures, once just shadows, now began to materialize in full. They were not human. They could not be. Their faces were distorted, grotesque, as if they were once alive but had been twisted and mangled beyond recognition. Their eyes were black voids, empty of any emotion except an insatiable hunger. And then, amidst this twisted sea of bodies, a new figure appeared. At first, Ethan wasn't sure if it was real, or if his mind had simply conjured another illusion. But as the figure drew closer, he could feel her presence, cold, chilling, and unyielding. A woman, or what remained of one, stepped into the mist. Her face was hidden beneath matted hair, the strands hanging like twisted ropes over her eyes. She wore tattered white cloth, the fabric torn and stained with something dark, something he dared not look at too closely. Her feet moved soundlessly across the ground, as though the earth itself could not bear her weight. But what drew Ethan's attention the most was the feeling that emanated from her, a feeling so palpable that it made his heart freeze in his chest. She was not like the others. The figures around him were grotesque, mindless, trapped, just as he was. But she was something else. Her very presence was heavy, like an anchor pulling him towards some terrible fate. She seemed aware of him, her head tilting slightly as she caught his gaze. And in that moment, something shifted in the air, something ancient and malignant. You've heard it, haven't you? Her voice was a whisper, but it rang in Ethan's mind, clear and unmistakable. The song, the dance, it never ends. Ethan swallowed, his throat dry and constricted. He tried to speak, but his voice was swallowed by the overwhelming sound of the violin. The music swelled, rising in a frenzy, louder and more chaotic. It felt as though it was coming from inside his skull, rattling his bones with its violent rhythm. The woman moved closer, her footsteps silent despite the sheer weight of her presence. Her hands, pale and trembling, reached out to touch his arm. The instant her fingers made contact, a coldness seeped into his skin, spreading through his veins like ice. He gasped, stumbling back, but her grip tightened, her nails digging into his flesh. "Don't try to escape." Her voice was both soothing and terrifying. "You're already part of it now, part of the dance." The words sent a shiver down his spine, a horrible realization flooding his mind. He was no longer a person. He was a prisoner. The dance had claimed him. There was no escape. His body was no longer his own. His soul was no longer his own. Her face slowly lifted, and for the first time Ethan saw her eyes. They were hollow, empty, a black abyss that seemed to stretch on forever, pulling him in. And in the depths of those eyes, he saw flashes of something familiar. A memory. His own face, twisted in agony, trapped in the same endless waltz. "Look into my eyes, Ethan." Her voice was a soft melodic hum now, like the echo of a lullaby, sweet, yet poisonous. "I was once like you, a dancer, a victim. I tried to resist, but it's pointless. The violin claims us all in the end." The violin shrieked again, louder this time, as if in agreement. Ethan's knees buckled, his body betraying him as it continued to move against his will, each step more frantic than the last. His mind was a blur of confusion and dread. He wanted to scream, to beg for release, but the music drowned him out, its tempo pushing him onward. "It's already begun," the woman whispered, stepping closer. Her breath was cold against his ear. "You can't fight it. You will dance forever, just as I do." Ethan's eyes widened as the fog shifted, revealing more figures, more lost souls, all trapped in the same dance, all bound by the same invisible force. They moved in a rhythmic, grotesque waltz, their faces just as twisted and distorted as the woman's. Their eyes, like hers, were hollow, empty, echoes of their former selves. "You see now?" she continued, her voice growing softer, more distant. "The dance never ends. It is a circle, a cycle, and you are in it, just like me." Ethan could feel the last remnants of his sanity slipping away as the truth hit him. There was no escape from this nightmare. The music, the dance, it was all consuming. He was trapped in a hell of his own making, unable to escape, unable to stop the relentless rhythm that pulled him further into madness. The woman's voice faded as the fog closed in once again, enveloping them all in an endless cycle of music and torment. And in the distance, the violin played on. Chapter 7. Whispers in the Dark. The moon was no longer a beacon in the night sky. It had become a hollow eye, glaring down on the world with a malicious intent. Ethan felt its weight as he stumbled through the fog, the cool mist swirling around him like an oppressive shroud. It was no longer a comforting presence. but a cruel reminder of the world that had left him behind, of the life he could never return to. His feet moved on their own accord, guided by the same invisible strings that had trapped him in this nightmare. He didn't know how long he had been wandering, how much time had passed since the first note of that haunting violin. It was pointless to think of time. The curse had stolen it from him. His mind was a fractured thing, pieces of himself breaking off like shards of glass that could never be pieced back together. He no longer remembered what it was like to feel truly human, to feel the warmth of the sun on his skin, or the taste of food on his tongue. There was only the fog, the music, the endless dance. Ethan's body jerked involuntarily, his arms swaying with a rhythm that wasn't his own. His feet shuffled, but they didn't belong to him. They never had. He was nothing but a puppet, the strings pulled by the unseen forces that surrounded him, whispering in his ears, calling to him in voices that no human could understand. His eyes, once filled with confusion, now stared blankly into the fog, unable to comprehend what was real anymore. His vision had become a blur, a nightmare that never ended. And still, the music played. The screeching violin, its notes sharper than 1,000 knives, cut through his mind. It was a sound that should have driven him mad, a sound that should have torn him apart. But it didn't. He had long since stopped feeling anything for it. It had become a part of him. It had claimed him, body and soul. He could no longer remember what it was like to live without it. Through the thick mist, figures appeared. No, not figures, shadows. They moved like puppets, their bodies swaying with the rhythm of the cursed song. Ethan's heart skipped a beat as they grew closer. He recognized them. Ghostly faces, twisted in agony, eyes wide open but unseeing, staring into the void. They were the ones who had danced before him, the ones who had fallen into the same trap, their souls forever bound to the song. He had seen them before, and yet something was different this time. They were watching him. He tried to stop, to break free from the dance, but it was futile. His feet moved without his consent. The music filled his ears, drowning out all other sounds, and in that silence, the whispers began. Soft at first, like the flutter of wings against the wind, but growing louder with each passing second. "You can't escape," one whispered, its voice dripping with malice, as though it came from the very air itself. "We're all the same," another voice added, colder now, more insistent. "We're all trapped. There's no way out." Ethan's pulse quickened. His body moved faster, jerking with the rhythm, but his mind was screaming. He wanted to stop. He wanted to tear his limbs off and run as far away from this nightmare as he could, but he couldn't. The music wouldn't let him. The voices wouldn't let him. "We've all danced this dance," the voices said in unison, and the sound reverberated through his chest, rattling his bones. "We've all been chosen. We all dance forever." Suddenly, a figure broke through the fog. A man, tall and gaunt, his face hidden beneath a hood, his body cloaked in tattered black robes. He moved like a shadow, his feet barely touching the ground as he glided toward Ethan. The man's presence sent a jolt of terror through Ethan's body, a visceral reaction he couldn't control. There was something about him, something wrong, something otherworldly. Ethan tried to pull away, but his feet refused to obey. The man's eyes glowed faintly, 2 pinpricks of light in the darkness. They fixed on Ethan, and for a moment, everything else in the world seemed to fade away. "You are still resisting," the man said, his voice low, but it vibrated through Ethan's skull, like the sound of the violin, deep and resonant. "Why? You cannot fight it. You cannot escape it." The man reached out, his hand cold as ice, and placed it on Ethan's chest. Ethan felt the chill penetrate his skin, seeping into his very bones. The warmth of life seemed to drain out of him, leaving only the hollow emptiness behind. His breath came in short gasps, but there was no relief. The music, the whispers, the figures dancing around him, they were all closing in. "You think you can outrun the song?" the man asked, his voice a rasping whisper now. "The song that calls to you in the dark. You think you can escape what you were chosen for?" Ethan's eyes widened. Chosen. The words sent a shudder through him. He had known it, of course, deep down. From the moment the violin's music had first reached his ears, he had known. He had been chosen, but he didn't understand why. Why him? Why this place? Why this dance? The man's lips curled into a grotesque smile beneath his hood. "You are not the first," he continued, his voice barely more than a hiss. "There have been others who thought they could break free, but they are all here now, all dancing, all lost." Ethan's heart raced, his pulse thumping in his ears. He wanted to scream, to demand answers, but his mouth was dry, his throat closed. The words wouldn't come. The man's hand, still resting on his chest, tightened its grip. Ethan felt his breath catch in his throat. He felt cold, colder than he had ever felt in his life. "There is no escape," the man said again, his voice softer now, almost soothing. "There is only the dance, only the music. It is all that remains." Ethan's knees buckled and he fell to the ground, but his body still moved, still twitched in time with the rhythm. The fog thickened, the whispers growing louder, more insistent, until they filled his head completely. He could no longer hear his own thoughts. He could no longer feel his own heart. All that remained was the music and the dance. A shadow passed over him, and the man's face appeared before him. Close now, too close. His eyes were empty, black pits that seemed to stretch on forever, swallowing the very light. Ethan felt himself falling into them, falling into that endless void. The music grew louder, a scream that tore through his mind, breaking everything apart until there was nothing left. "You are lost," the man whispered, his voice fading into the distance as Ethan's consciousness shattered. "We are all lost." And then, nothing. Chapter 7. Whispers in the Dark continued. The fog thickened as Ethan stumbled forward, his feet dragging across the earth that no longer seemed to belong to him. He didn't know what had happened to the man in the black robes, or why he had disappeared, but the air felt colder now, as if the entire world were holding its breath. The shadows around him seemed to stretch, twisting like living things, and the whispers never stopped. They were coming from all around him now, from within the fog, from the trees that seemed to lean in closer, from the earth beneath his feet. They weren't the soft, indistinct murmurs of before. No. Now the voices were clearer, sharper, filled with urgency and malice. Ethan couldn't understand the words, but he could feel the emotions behind them, a constant, gnawing hunger. And the song. The song continued, relentless and never-ending. It began as a low hum, a vibration in the air, but as time passed it grew louder. The screech of the violin echoed in his mind, and he felt it pull at his very soul, as though the music were dragging him deeper into the abyss. His limbs moved of their own accord, his body once again forced to dance against his will. But now there was something new. As his feet shuffled across the uneven ground, Ethan felt something brushing against his skin, something cold, wet, and alive. He froze mid-step, his heart pounding in his chest. Slowly, his eyes traced the sensation to his arm, where a shadow slithered over his skin, like liquid darkness pooling from the fog itself. It was almost tangible. Something was wrapping itself around him. He recoiled, but it was no use. The shadow had already claimed him. A soft, wet laugh echoed from the fog, and Ethan's breath caught in his throat. The laughter wasn't human. It wasn't even alive, but it had the sound of something that had been long dead, something that had forgotten the meaning of joy but still found the bitter taste of it in the suffering of others. "Do you think you can resist, little dancer?" The voice taunted, this time more distinct. It sounded almost amused. The shadow that had wrapped around his arm began to tighten, cold fingers latching onto his skin, squeezing the life out of him, as though the very fog itself was becoming a part of him. Ethan tried to scream, but the air was suffocating, his throat too dry. He was choking on the darkness. His eyes darted around wildly, searching for a way out, but all he could see were the twisting shapes of the fog, faces emerging from it, contorting into grotesque visages of agony. Their mouths stretched wide in silent screams, their eyes hollow, endless pits that seemed to stare directly into his soul. And then, as if the fog had eyes of its own, the shadows began to form shapes. Figures emerged from the mist, not quite human, but not quite anything else. Their bodies were skeletal, their skin pale and rotting, and their movements were slow, deliberate, as though they were rehearsing a dance that had been passed down through the ages. One of them reached out for him, its fingers long and twisted, its skin like decaying paper. The thing's mouth opened, and the sound that came from it wasn't a scream, but a low, guttural hum, as though it was trying to mimic the violin's song. The air itself trembled as the figure came closer, and Ethan could feel the cold from its body. It was alive. It was alive in a way that no living thing should be. "You will dance," the thing whispered, its voice hollow and warped. "You will dance until there is nothing left of you." The world began to distort, the edges of his vision warping as the figure's voice echoed in his mind. The whispers grew louder until they became a deafening roar, filling every corner of his skull. The ground beneath his feet began to sway, the air heavy with a metallic scent. Blood. No, it couldn't be. Not here. Not now. Ethan tried to pull away, to break free from the figure's grasp, but his body refused to obey. He had no control over it. His limbs jerked, moving to the rhythm of the haunting violin, the song dragging him deeper into the night, deeper into the darkness. His legs buckled, and he collapsed to his knees, his breath shallow and ragged. "Stop, please," he begged, though he wasn't sure if the words would reach the thing. "Please, I can't do this anymore." But the thing only chuckled, a low, rattling sound that made Ethan's skin crawl. "You think you're the first?" it rasped. "You think you're special? No, dancer, you are not special. You are just another lost soul, another wretched fool who couldn't resist the music. Now, you will dance for eternity, just like the others." The laughter continued, but it faded into something else, a guttural, horrifying growl that seemed to come from all around him. The shadows began to close in, the figures surrounding him, their eyes gleaming with hunger. The whispers turned to shouts, all voices converging into a single, monstrous scream. The ground shook beneath his knees, and a horrible pressure built in the air. Suddenly, the figure's hand tightened on his arm, pulling him upright. Ethan screamed, feeling the cold fingers dig into his flesh like claws, tearing through his clothes and into his skin. His heart pounded wildly in his chest, his mind a storm of terror. "You will dance," it said again, but this time its voice was no longer human. It was something older, something darker, the voice of the fog itself, a thing that had no origin and no end. Ethan's breath hitched as his eyes locked on the thing's face, twisted in eternal torment. Its eyes were wide, empty sockets, like black holes that threatened to swallow him whole. It leaned closer, its breath rancid and cold against his face, and whispered in his ear, "You will dance, or you will die." And in that moment, Ethan understood. He understood what he had to do. He had no choice. There was no escape. He was already dead. All that remained was the dance. As the shadow pulled him back onto his feet, Ethan felt his body move again, jerking in rhythm with the music. His arms lifted against his will, his legs shuffling forward as though they were merely extensions of the dark force that had claimed him. His eyes blurred, the world around him twisting as he was forced into the same grotesque, repetitive movements. And then, he saw them. Figures in the mist, their bodies contorted and twisted in unnatural ways. Their faces were blank, expressionless, but their eyes were filled with something darker than anything Ethan could comprehend. And they were all looking at him, watching him, waiting for him to join their dance. The song grew louder, more insistent. Ethan could feel it deep in his chest, reverberating through his very bones, like a pulse. There was no escape. There would never be an escape. And as the shadows surrounded him, their bodies shifting, swaying with the rhythm of the cursed music, Ethan knew. He was just another lost soul in the eternal dance, a dancer who would never stop moving, never stop dying, forever. Chapter 8. The Dance of the Forgotten. The night never truly arrived. It was as if the sky had forgotten the idea of day and night entirely, caught somewhere between the two. neither light nor dark. The world outside Ethan's senses had become a fragmented dream, a thing of shadows that clung to his body, whispering truths he could not comprehend, pulling him deeper into a spiral from which there was no return. Ethan awoke again, though whether it was sleep or some grotesque parody of it, he could not say. His body was stiff, a broken doll whose strings had been cut long ago. The air was still, suffocating, the same as before. A cold that gnawed at his bones clung to him like an unwanted embrace. Every inch of him screamed in silent agony, but his mouth was paralyzed, frozen in time, and the song, it hadn't stopped. The violin's tune wove through the air, smooth and relentless, twisting itself around his mind. Each note reverberated in his chest like a slow, painful heartbeat, dragging him from one dark thought to the next. The music was an echo in the void, the only thing constant in the madness that had claimed him. He could almost feel the bow moving across the strings, could almost see the figure whose fingers moved in perfect synchrony with the melody. But when he tried to focus on the image, on the man in the black robes, with the pale face hidden beneath his hood, the fog returned. The mist seemed to obscure his vision, a thick, choking blanket that muffled everything. The man was gone. Perhaps he had never been there at all. The ground beneath Ethan's feet was slick with something wet and foul. He took a tentative step, the feeling of it, cold, slick, like stepping through a thin film of decay. His foot sank a little with each movement, as if the earth itself was softening beneath his weight. He didn't want to look down. He knew what would be there, the bones, the eyes, the countless souls that had come before him, their remains now part of the soil he walked on. The air was filled with the sound of movement, but it was not his. No. The footsteps came from behind him, slow and deliberate, a pattern that repeated itself in a way that left him wondering how long it had been there. The dance had begun again. He was once more pulled into its insistent rhythm, his body moving even when he resisted, his limbs jerking in the direction they were meant to go. He was a puppet, a marionette with strings pulled by an unseen force. "Stop," he whispered, though his voice was only a hushed echo against the suffocating silence. But the words were useless. They were lost to the fog. His eyes darted around the space, desperate to find something familiar, something to hold on to, but nothing looked the same. The place had changed, twisted, distorted into a macabre reflection of reality. The trees that once stood tall and proud had now become grotesque shapes, their bark peeling away to reveal raw, blood-red flesh beneath. Their branches stretched out like skeletal fingers, groping at the air as if searching for him, seeking to drag him into their embrace. Above him, the sky was an endless swirl of shifting colors, black, deep purple, and an unnatural shade of green that made his stomach churn. There was no moon. There were no stars. The void above felt like it was closing in, folding in on itself like the pages of a book that had been torn apart. "Do you hear them?" A voice suddenly rasped from the shadows. Ethan froze. He had hoped the voice would go away, but it came again, louder this time. "Do you hear their whispers? They are waiting, just like you. They are waiting for the song to call them." Ethan turned, his breath shallow, heart hammering in his chest. From the darkness, a figure emerged, though it was not the man in black. This one was different. Its shape was amorphous, a blur of indistinctness that flickered like a candle in the wind. It hovered, just above the ground, its limbs long and spindly, the joints bending at impossible angles. The figure was silent, but its presence was overwhelming. The whispers grew louder, as if 100 voices had coalesced into a single, maddening murmur that scraped against Ethan's mind. He couldn't understand them, but he knew what they wanted. It wasn't enough for them to see him dance. They wanted him to understand the purpose of it. They wanted him to feel it. The creature reached out a long, bony finger and pointed directly at him. "You were never meant to stop, Ethan." His pulse quickened. He had no name anymore, not really. No memory of his past life, only the endless cyclical dance that had consumed him. He thought he might scream, but his mouth was dry, his voice a mere whisper lost in the wind. The creature continued, its voice now a low hiss that seemed to vibrate in his very bones. "They are waiting for you to lead them, Ethan. You are the next conductor. You have no choice. You must play the song. You must play it until there is nothing left of you. He took a step back, but his body refused to stop. His legs moved of their own accord, dragging him forward into the dark embrace of the figure. Every movement felt like his own death. The whispers in the air intensified, and Ethan's skin crawled as though invisible hands were crawling beneath it. The air began to pulse with heat, sudden, suffocating. Sweat beaded on his forehead, and his heart pounded louder, faster. With every step he took, the shadows seemed to flicker, closing in on him, but he couldn't stop moving. The song grew louder, a deafening chorus of violins, strings drawn across the bones of the world itself. "Stop it, please," he screamed, his voice cracking in the thick, humid air. But the words were swallowed by the silence, as if the world itself had stopped listening. The creature stepped closer, its face emerging from the shadows. The face was not human. It was a collection of shifting forms, eyes that blinked in unison, mouths that twisted open and closed in grotesque patterns, faces that flickered and merged into something unrecognizable. And yet, through it all, it smiled. A smile that wasn't a smile at all, but a jagged thing, like the rictus grin of a skull. "Do you hear it, Ethan?" the thing whispered, its breath hot and rancid against his ear. "The song calls for you." Ethan wanted to resist. He wanted to break free, to shout, to fight, but his body betrayed him. The rhythm of the dance had taken root in his soul. He was moving without choice, a puppet caught in the unrelenting cadence of something far older than him, something far darker. The ground began to pulse beneath his feet, the earth itself seeming to tremble in sync with the song. Ethan felt the pull of the shadows, felt them creeping beneath his skin. There was no escape. Would he dance until he died? His heart broke as the thought settled in. He would die. He could feel it now. The end was coming. And in that moment, he realized the terrible truth. There was no end to the dance. The dance was the end. And so, Ethan danced. Chapter 9. The Dance of the Lost. The air was thick with the scent of decay, not the typical rotting earth or the musky odor of dead leaves, but something far more sinister, a stench of forgotten memories and the creeping fog of despair that hung low to the ground, curling its fingers around every corner. Ethan's senses had dulled in the time that had passed, but even now, the sharp tang of the air cut through the numbness of his existence. There was no more running. Ethan had stopped asking questions long ago. There was no point anymore. The answers that had once burned in his mind had long turned to ash. The truth had become a puzzle, each piece shifting as he tried to grasp it, only to have it slip away. Each corner of this twisted world seemed to warp further, like the contours of a nightmare being drawn out into the waking hours, stretching across his consciousness until the line between reality and his fractured mind no longer existed. He had long stopped caring about escape. The dance had him. The rhythm had sunk into his bones, and now he felt its pull every moment, a song that played whether he wished it or not. And yet, even as his limbs moved with a strange, hollow precision, his heart still longed for freedom. It was the only thing that kept him from completely unraveling. But there was no freedom here. There was only the endless spinning, the endless turning, the endless music that never ceased. A melody born of despair, of something ancient and grotesque. It was a call, a lure, and Ethan could not ignore it. As he stumbled across the cracked and shattered ground, a strange, almost imperceptible hum filled the air. It was faint, so faint that he thought it might be in his head. But no, it was real. It echoed through the fog, reverberating in the air around him, tugging at his mind, pulling at his soul. He followed it, not out of curiosity, but because there was no choice. The song was a magnet, and he was nothing more than a metal scrap, drawn toward it like the inevitable collision of two forces. The world had become a twisted theatre, the ground beneath him a stage on which he was forced to perform. The faces of the dead, those who had come before him, lined the edges of his vision, their eyes hollow, their lips sewn shut in eternal silence. They watched, always watching, but never speaking, never making a sound. Their faces had long since lost any semblance of humanity, replaced by something darker, something far more chilling. Ethan wanted to scream, but no sound escaped his throat. His mouth was parched, and the words he had once known seemed foreign, as if they belonged to a past life, a life that was no longer his. His limbs moved in time with the music, each step a continuation of the one before. The rhythm was relentless. The fog around him thickened. It wrapped around his legs, pulling at him, whispering to him in a language he couldn't understand. The words sounded like the fluttering of wings, like the rustling of paper, like the murmurs of something waiting just beyond the edge of his perception. He could feel it then, the pull of something else, something beyond the music, something lurking in the shadows. It watched him, this presence. He could feel its eyes, though he could not see them. Suddenly, the air grew cold. An unnatural chill settled over him, one that sank into his skin, crawling under his bones, stealing the warmth from his body. The mist shifted, swirling in a vortex around him, and then, there, a figure emerged from the fog. At first, it was nothing more than a silhouette, a dark shape against the shifting backdrop of the fog. But as it drew closer, Ethan could make out the details. A figure in a long, tattered cloak, its face hidden beneath the shadow of a hood. A face that was not quite human, its features distorted, as though they had been stretched, pulled out of shape. There were no eyes, only empty sockets that seemed to absorb the very light around them. "Do you see it now?" The figure spoke, its voice low, a rasping whisper that seemed to crawl into his ears. The sound was sickening, like 1,000 rats scurrying through the walls of his mind. "Do you understand?" Ethan could feel his breath quicken, his heart pounding in his chest. He wanted to run, to flee, but his body was not his own anymore. It moved of its own accord, stepping closer to the figure as if it were compelled, drawn by an invisible thread. His body ached, as if he were being pulled through thick mud, each movement a struggle against an unseen force. The figure stepped forward, and in the moonlight, its face, if it could be called a face, became clearer. There were no eyes, no lips, no features at all, just a smooth, featureless surface. The face of a skull but without the bone, just empty, smooth skin. Ethan could feel the pull of it, the force of its presence dragging him forward, deeper into the fog, into the waiting dark. The figure didn't speak again, but it didn't need to. Its presence spoke louder than any words could. "You are lost," the figure whispered, though its lips did not move. "You have been lost from the very beginning." The words slithered into his mind, coating his thoughts with a sickening heaviness. He tried to push them away, to ignore them, but they lingered, wrapping around his brain, seeping into the cracks that had formed in his sanity. "You will dance forever," it continued, its voice now a low, mocking tone, as if it found something grotesque in the very idea of hope. "Forever, Ethan. And when you do, you will join us." The words hung in the air, thick as the fog that now surrounded him on all sides. Ethan felt the weight of them settle over him like a heavy cloak. The darkness, once so distant, was now all-encompassing, its cold fingers reaching into his very soul. "Join us?" Ethan choked, his throat raw. His mind was spinning, the world around him twisting, bending. The figure leaned closer, its faceless head tilting at an odd angle. "Yes, Ethan. You'll join the others. You'll dance with them. Forever. The song is endless, and so are you." Suddenly the music changed. It shifted, the melody warping into something darker, more insistent. The violin's strings screamed in agony, and the world seemed to vibrate with the force of it. The dance was not just a movement anymore. It was a force, a tide that swept Ethan along with it. His body had no choice but to comply, his feet moving in time with the music, his limbs jerking with each note, each beat. He was nothing more than a puppet. And yet, despite everything, Ethan still held on to that last shred of defiance. He wanted to scream, to cry out, to break free. But all he could do was move. The figure's form faded into the mist, its hollow eyes still watching, always watching. In that moment, Ethan understood. He understood the price of the dance, and he understood that there was no escape. Chapter 10. The Eternal Waltz. The fog pressed in from all sides. A relentless, creeping presence that sought to suffocate every breath Ethan drew. It had no beginning and no end, swirling around him like a living entity, suffusing the world with its cold embrace. The dance continued, his legs moving with a grace that felt unnatural, his feet stepping in time with a rhythm that wasn't his own. It was no longer just a song. It was a compulsion, a force that had taken root in his body and soul. The more he struggled, the more the rhythm tightened its hold. Each step he took seemed to lead him deeper into the fog, further into the unknown. The figure that had spoken to him, the faceless being, was gone, but its words lingered, echoing in his mind like the distant hum of an ancient bell. "You will join us." Ethan didn't know what that meant, but he felt it, the truth of it, as cold and inevitable as the dark that surrounded him. He was being drawn somewhere, not just physically, but mentally, spiritually. Somewhere he did not want to go. The music was relentless. A violin wove through the air, its strings screeching, bending under the weight of the sorrow they carried. The beat of the drums thundered in his chest, synchronized with the pulse of his own heart. The world around him shifted, spinning and warping like the blurred edges of a nightmare. He could feel his own sense of self dissolving, slipping through his fingers like smoke. There were no sounds of life here, no birds, no animals, only the music and the silence in between. And then, from the corners of his vision, he saw them, faces, pale and sickly, their eyes hollow, their mouths open in silent screams. Ghosts, or perhaps memories of those who had danced before him, the ones who had gotten lost in this wretched place, drawn to its eternal waltz. They flitted in and out of his vision, their forms flickering like shadows caught in the corner of his eye. They danced too, but their movements were jerky, their limbs bent at unnatural angles, as if the dance had twisted their very bodies out of shape. Their eyes followed him as he moved, their empty gazes tracking his every step. And every time he looked at them, he saw something new. Their faces were a mosaic of horror and pain, their expressions locked in a silent scream. They were no longer human, but something else, something wrong. Ethan felt their eyes upon him, even as he continued to move in the rhythm of the dance. It was as if the very fog itself was watching him. No, waiting for him to slip up, to falter, to break. Every part of him screamed to stop, to break free, but his body had become a puppet to the music. Every muscle in his limbs obeyed the rhythm, as though it was bound by invisible strings. "You are lost," the faceless figure had said. "You have always been lost." And Ethan realized with a creeping dread that those words were true. There was no escape, no salvation. He wasn't just trapped here. He was meant to be here. He had always been meant to be here. His life had been nothing but a prelude to this moment. The moment when the dance would claim him, as it had claimed so many before him. The fog thickened, and the faces of the lost dancers grew clearer, their movements more pronounced. Some of them reached out, their hands twisted and clawed, as if they were begging for something, maybe for help, maybe for company in their eternal torment. Ethan's mind was overwhelmed by their presence, by the sheer weight of their gaze. One of the faces caught his attention more than the others. It was a woman, her long dark hair matted with something that looked like blood. Her eyes were wide, unblinking, locked onto his. Her mouth opened in a silent scream, her hands outstretched as if begging him to take her hand. But her fingers, they were not human anymore. They were sharp, like claws, twitching and reaching toward him with unnatural speed. Ethan recoiled instinctively, but his body kept moving, kept dancing. His legs carried him forward, toward the woman, who was now smiling, a twisted, grotesque smile that split her face in half. It was a smile of welcome, or perhaps a warning, but it was not a smile that belonged to any living creature. The moment he reached her, her hand shot out and gripped his wrist, her fingers digging into his skin like a vice. "You will join us," she whispered, her voice a raspy, echoing breath that chilled him to the bone. It's too late now. He tried to pull away, to break free, but the more he fought, the more the music grew louder, the rhythm pulsing through his body, forcing him to move. He could feel his grip on reality slipping, his sense of self unraveling with every beat. "Don't fight it!" she hissed, her lips curling into that grotesque smile once more. "You'll never escape." Suddenly, the world around him twisted violently. The fog rolled back, revealing a massive, hollow cavern, stretching as far as the eye could see. It was an abyss, a yawning chasm of darkness. And standing at the edge of the cavern, holding hands with the other dancers, were the figures of those who had come before him. They were waiting, watching, waiting for him to join them in their eternal waltz. Ethan could feel the weight of their presence, the pull of their emptiness. It was a force stronger than any will to survive, stronger than his desire to escape. His limbs, his body, everything was being drawn toward the abyss, to the edge of the chasm where the music grew louder, more deafening. The dancers, all of them, stood at the precipice, waiting for him to join their endless cycle. "You're here," the woman said, her voice now a soft, sad sigh. "You've always been here." And in that moment, Ethan realized the terrible truth. The dance wasn't just about movement. It was about time. The eternal waltz was a loop, a never-ending cycle, pulling souls into its grasp over and over again, until they became a part of the dance itself. The faces of the dancers, the lost, the broken, the forgotten, stared back at him, their eyes hollow, their bodies bent and twisted by the dance. They had all once been like him. All of them had once tried to fight, to escape. But now, they were part of the rhythm, their movements as much a part of the music as the violin's mournful cry. The figure stepped forward again, its faceless head tilting. It raised its hand, gesturing toward the abyss. "You see," it said, its voice now clear and resonant. "This is where we all belong. This is where we're meant to be. The dance goes on, and so do we. Forever." Ethan could feel it now. His body, his mind, everything about him was merging with the rhythm. His feet moved of their own accord. His limbs jerked in time with the music, and his mind was swallowed whole by the song. There was no more resistance. There was only the dance. As his body fell into the pattern, his eyes closing in surrender, he could hear the final haunting notes of the violin. They resonated deep inside him, echoing through his very soul. And as the last note played, everything went dark. Chapter 10. The endless spiral continued. The darkness lingered, thick and all-consuming, a blackness that seemed to stretch on forever. There was no ground beneath Ethan's feet, no air to breathe, no sense of time or space. He felt nothing, just the silence of the abyss wrapping itself around him, suffocating every thought, every whisper of life he once clung to. And yet, in that profound emptiness, a faint pulse began to emerge, a heartbeat. It started slow, rhythmic, barely noticeable. But it grew louder, stronger, a steady thrum that reverberated through the very core of his being. The beat was like a heartbeat, not just of his body, but of something much older, something that had always been there, something eternal. A single thin thread of light broke through the darkness, cutting through the void with its pale, ghostly gleam. It flickered at first, uncertain, like a flame barely surviving a storm. Ethan's mind, still reeling from the overwhelming sensation of being swallowed whole by the rhythm, tried to focus. He needed to understand. He needed to break free from this madness. As his thoughts began to sharpen, the light expanded, revealing the faint outline of the ballroom, distant at first, then growing closer, closer, until it enveloped him entirely. He was no longer floating, no longer lost in the formless dark. He was back in the dance. But the ballroom had changed. It was no longer the grand hall where he had danced before. It had transformed, warped into something far darker, more grotesque. The walls seemed to pulse with life, shifting as if they were breathing. The chandeliers above were no longer crystal, but made of twisted bones, their light flickering with a sickly yellow glow. The floor, once polished and immaculate, was cracked and uneven, as though it had been ravaged by time and despair. The figures were still there, their movements eerily synchronized, their hollow eyes locked on him. But now, they were not just faceless dancers. No, they had become something more. Their bodies were rotting, their flesh peeling away in patches, revealing the decayed, exposed bone beneath. The stench of death lingered in the air, mixing with the sharp metallic tang of blood. The sound of their footsteps, once graceful, now echoed like hollow thuds, dragging through the grime on the floor. And then, the music began again. A faint, eerie melody, like a lullaby woven into the very fabric of the atmosphere. It played from nowhere and everywhere, filling the room with its chilling sweetness. The violins screamed in agony, the drums pounded like a heartbeat from some ancient beast, and the piano keys bled into each other, creating a discordant harmony that tugged at the very edges of sanity. Ethan's feet moved involuntarily, responding to the rhythm. But now, it felt different. His movements were jerky, disjointed, as though his body was resisting the music, but failing to escape its grasp. Every step brought him closer to the dancers, closer to the others who had been consumed by this cycle. The woman from before, the one with the twisted smile, was waiting for him, standing at the center of the room. Her face was even more grotesque now, half melted, her eyes nothing but blackened sockets, and her mouth stretched wide in a horrific grin. Her fingers twitched, beckoning him closer. "You thought you could escape," she whispered, her voice raspy, like the sound of bones grinding together. "You thought you were free, but you were always one of us." He wanted to scream, wanted to break free, but no sound came. His throat was dry, his breath ragged, and his limbs were heavy, as if the very air in the room was pressing against him. He couldn't fight it any longer. The rhythm, the compulsion, everything inside him screamed to surrender. And then, with a sickening crack, his body gave in. His feet slid into the groove of the dance, his limbs now moving with the same unnatural fluidity as the others. He could feel the darkness creeping into his mind, pulling him down into its endless pit. His thoughts, once his own, were now tangled with the voices of the dancers, those who had come before him, those who had been swallowed by the waltz. He could hear their whispers now, like a chorus of hollow voices singing in unison. "Join us, forever." Their eyes were upon him, those hollow, dead eyes that had once been human. He could see the sorrow in them, the despair, the helplessness. They had been here too long, caught in this cycle of eternal waltz, and now their souls were forever lost. They weren't just dancing, they were trapped, trapped in the rhythm, trapped in the song, trapped in the darkness that surrounded them. Ethan's body moved against his will, his arms lifting to encircle the woman who had invited him into this nightmare. As his hands touched her decaying skin, a shock of coldness spread through him, like 1,000 needles piercing his veins. The cold was suffocating, crawling into every part of him. It spread through his chest, tightening his heart, freezing his very soul. The woman's eyes flashed with dark amusement as she leaned in, her lips brushing against his ear. "You're one of us now," she hissed. "Forever." The music crescendoed, drowning out everything else. Ethan could feel his mind slipping away, drowning in the rhythm. His last thoughts were a fleeting memory of the world outside. The sunlight, the warmth of human connection, the life he had once known. But those thoughts were quickly smothered by the dark pull of the dance. There was no escaping now. The waltz had claimed him, and in return he had become part of it. Time no longer existed. Space had lost all meaning. The only thing that remained was the music, the rhythm, the eternal dance, and somewhere, in the deepest corners of his soul, Ethan knew he would never escape. He was part of the waltz now, one of the lost, one of the damned, doomed to dance for eternity in the twisted ballroom of the dead.